Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. The intense tingling that the man felt in his groin as he released jet after jet of liquid into the little woman beneath him quickly turned into a burning pain in his chest. He screamed as confusion reigned in his brain. A man standing 1.90 meters and weighing 111 kilograms should have been 3 meters tall and bulletproof, and not in terrible pain, he thought, and this was the last thought when he collapsed dead on top of a woman. "Hey, it hurts, you big idiot!" she screamed, trying to make him move. "It's not funny, Fred, and you probably lasted about 10 minutes. Fred, release me." Penelope Mattern's lover, 29-year-old Fred Desmond, lay lifeless, heavy on her body. One of her arms was clamped under him. She tried her best to wriggle out from under his weight, but he was too big for her, especially since he was literally a dead weight. She tried to reach her mobile phone with her free hand, but her hand was too short to reach the device. She began to sob, both from fear and disappointment. It became clear to her that today would not end well. 3 hours later, most of Penny's body was in a semi-fainting state when she heard the back door of the house open and her children enter. She asked them to call 911 and not go up to the second floor. "Maybe we should call Dad, too," her 15-year-old daughter asked her. "No, no," Penny shouted back quickly. "Just call 911 and wait for them downstairs." Paramedics arrived at the house 5 minutes later. After making sure that the children were all right, they went up the stairs and found Penny and her dead lover. Penny looked more guilty than a child who got her hand into the proverbial cookie jar. The medics exchanged quick grins with each other, and Penny noticed it. "You probably won't believe this, but this isn't the first time we've seen this, ma'am," the older of the two paramedics said. "Obviously, such situations are very stressful and heart attacks happen." "Yes, but he was only 29 years old," Penny said in a barely audible whisper. "Then the autopsy should tell the coroner something interesting," the junior paramedic said. Turning the body over, both paramedics gasped. Fred Desmond was a handsome evening news anchor at the CBS affiliate in Lansing, Michigan. His star was rising rapidly, and in some circles it was known that in the near future, he would move to the leading chair in a large market. After paramedics put the dead man on a gurney and covered him, they examined Penny, as she had been lying under the man's weight for more than 2 hours. She seemed to be in good physical condition, although she was advised to see a mental health specialist. "Lying under a corpse is the least of my problems," she said shyly. Penny had barely put on a fluffy bathrobe when her husband Dan burst into the room, out of breath from the rapid ascent of the stairs. "Are you kidding me?" he yelled at his wife when she stepped away from him. Both paramedics stood in front of the woman. "Mr. Mattern, this may not be the best time or place for this. Your children are downstairs," the senior paramedic said. Dan rolled his eyes. His breathing was ragged, and both paramedics knew it wasn't from running up the stairs. "In our own bed, Penny? How could it be worse? Look, Mr. Mattern, we can call the police in a few minutes if we feel your wife needs protection from you," the senior paramedic said. "I'm not going to hit her, although God knows she deserves it," Dan said. Both paramedics nodded in agreement. Penny caught the nods. "Did the kids call you?" Penny asked as paramedics carried the dead body out of the house. "No, I talked to them, and it turns out you told them not to call me. Great, great. Asking the kids to cover for you. You suck, do you know that?" "Janet called me from work from the next block when the ambulance arrived," Dan said. "I think the whole neighborhood already knows what happened." Since the call was on the police wave, within half an hour, all the news organizations in Lansing learned about the death of Fred Desmond. There was a debate in these editorial offices about whether to downplay the importance of death out of professional courtesy, or to give it more importance because of Desmond's prominence in Lansing society. Larry Richards immediately recognized the address where the ambulance was called when he was informed of the death of Fred Desmond. It was the home address of his mistress, Penny Mattern. He instantly understood what it meant and was shocked and hurt. He and Penny had been having an affair for a little over a year. He wrote to the woman without hesitation. "What the fuck is this?" Penny saw the text message on her phone, but at that moment, she had more important things to worry about. Larry has been an anchor at the NBC affiliate in Lansing for 6 years. He was respected in society, even though his career did not have the juice that his CBS competitor had. He certainly enjoyed using Penny, and was shocked and angered by what she was obviously doing to his rival as well. Larry knew that the station's news team would be discussing how to handle Desmond's death. He called the news editor and expressed his opinion. We need to take this story hard. The news editor was the only person at the station who knew that Larry was using Penny Mattern and was not surprised by Larry's opinion. He agreed with him. These bastards from CBS should be made a laughingstock. The fact that they had better ratings than his team was only part of his decision. Yes, that's right, he admitted to himself. Penny herself held a prominent place in the Lansing community, being the executive director of the city's highly respected arts guild. Two outstanding personalities in society are an undoubted plus for news coverage, the news editor noted to himself. Get dressed, go downstairs, and figure out how to explain to our kids what happened and why they're spending the next few days with your parents, Dan said. Don't be too outspoken, but don't try to downplay your mistake either. The kids are old enough to realize that you've screwed up big time. I will hear everything. Call your parents and tell them about it. And you can tell them the whole truth because I guess it's all going to be on the evening news tonight. Penny's green eyes became as wide as silver dollars. She hadn't thought about the news aspect of the story. In Dan's presence, Penny explained to the children that she had cheated on their father earlier in the day, in their own bed. The man she cheated on was the popular news anchor Fred Desmond, and when they were making love, Desmond died for an unknown reason. So you fucked him to death, Mom? Ellie, the couple's daughter, asked quite sincerely. Wow. Penny blushed profusely. Dan made a face and entered the family room. Dan waited until Penny and the kids had gone to her parents' house. He figured that 40 minutes to get there and back, plus another 20 to discuss with her parents, would give him an hour to do some important things, like find a good lawyer and split the finances. In his opinion, the divorce was self-evident. Everyone knows someone who was divorced. Dan knew several of them himself. One of them was a good friend of his at the national telecommunications firm where Dan worked. He made the call, among several others. Penny returned an hour and a half later, looking as if someone had repeatedly punched her in the stomach. Dan guessed that the conversation with Penny's parents hadn't gone too well. He knew that the Fitzmaurices were conservatives and were probably more than a little upset about their daughter's infidelity and the fact that it had become public. Penny sat down on the couch opposite Dan's chair with a raised footrest. Looking closer, he saw that she was crying a lot. It went as well as it should have if I'd expected a shit sandwich to be served over a fire, she moaned. I guess I deserve it. Dan looked at his wife impassively. She took it as a signal to continue. I'm sorry, Dan, I'm really sorry, she said. I'm sorry for cheating, I'm sorry for hurting you, and for blowing up our family in the most public way. You should know that publicity has never been part of my plans. Never. I have no idea what happened today. He was only 29 years old. Penny began to sob, hiding her face in her hands. Dan didn't move from his chair. She cried for a few minutes before lifting her head and saw the emptiness in Dan's eyes. She had never seen such a look from her loving husband before. How long did it take before you fucked him to death? Dan said calmly. Penny shuddered. I didn't beat him to death, she said sharply. I think we were together for about 3 months. We were together, that's a great term. It almost sounds like loved, so innocent. But I still prefer the word making love. It means exactly what it means, Dan said. He interviewed me for an article, she added. We were flirting, both of us. He was a big, handsome guy, a former college football player who kept himself in shape. We met for lunch several times and, one after the other, he was very good in bed. Have you always made love to him in our bed? She lowered her eyes. I suppose you know that he was married and had 2 small children. You left wonderful memories for them, Dan croaked. I don't want a divorce, Dan. You are welcome. I'll do whatever you want. Consultations if you want, please, she whined. Why should I care what you want? You had a 3-month affair with that freak. You made love to him in our bed. He died in our bed. It's probably going to be all over the news tonight. Damn, woman. The kids and I will always be ridiculed for not being able to keep your damn legs closed. Fred Desmond's death from an apparent heart attack in bed with a woman who was not his ex-wife made headline news on 3 of Lansing's 4 major television stations. Desmond's own station only noted that a 29-year-old boy had died of an apparent heart attack. That night, Dan moved into the guest room. He will never sleep in this bed again. Due to the negative publicity surrounding her affair with Desmond and his subsequent death, Penny was fired from her job. She understood that the board of directors had no other options if they wanted to keep the funding. She also received a call from her longtime lover, Larry Richards, to end their relationship. calling her every swear word he could think of to, among other things, question her honesty. "You're a damn fool. How many other guys have used you? We're done, cheater." This is only part of what he said during the 5-minute conversation. Penny didn't say anything special during the conversation. She was served at work the following week. Dan requested full custody of his children, and he had written requests from them to stay with their father. He told the judge that although he could afford to pay the mortgage on the house, he and his children would move in the future, because he expected the public to react extremely negatively to this. Penny looked depressed when she returned home that evening, but neither her husband nor the children tried to cheer her up. They have been ridiculed every day since the news of Desmond's death became known. With everything that was going on in her life, Penny didn't pay much attention to the fact that she didn't have another period. The next time it happened, she also felt sick and realized she was pregnant. A home test confirmed this. "Do you really hate me that much, God?" "What is it?" she asked herself aloud in the bathroom. She waited until the family had had dinner before telling them, and she grimaced when Dan choked on his food when she announced her pregnancy. She knew that he was thinking that the child could be his, in which case he would probably have to stay married to her. She would have considered it a stroke of luck, but Dan certainly wasn't. "I don't believe for a minute that this child is mine. We'll do a DNA test next month," Dan said, and Penny's hopeful expression disappeared. "You don't trust me?" she asked incredulously. "Have you ever shown me lately that I can trust you?" He rapped back. Fred Desmond's widow was unhappy when Dan Mattern's lawyer called and asked to take her late husband's DNA for comparison with the child Penny is carrying. The lawyer explained to Mrs. Desmond that if the child really belonged to Fred, then alimony would have to be paid from his inheritance. Dan Mattern was adamant and said he would not pay child support for someone else's child. Maggie Desmond clearly understood what Dan was getting at, but she still wasn't happy about it. "Stupid damn fool," she thought to herself. The testing was carried out over a 3-month period. To everyone's surprise, neither Dan nor the late Fred matched the DNA. "Really, Penny?" Dan shouted at her when the test results came in. "How many guys have you cheated on me with, you fool?" Penny's lawyer had to secure a subpoena before Larry Richards gave what turned out to be a matching sample of his DNA. Needless to say, Mrs. Larry Richards was not very happy to learn that her husband was using the #1 fool in Lansing, and for the next 18 years or so he would pay for this privilege. Penny's pregnancy with Larry made Dan's request to become the guardian of his 2 children a win-win. "I know I've already asked, but how long has this affair been going on, Penny?" Dan asked one evening when they were working out some details of the division of property. As if on cue, Penny blushed and apologized again. "What other news is there?" Dan thought to himself. "Larry and I were there. Lovers for over a year. We met once or twice every 2 weeks or so. You know, since I worked part-time, it was always pretty easy for me to get away during the day. You've been working all day and you've always trusted me completely. I've abused your trust so much, Dan. I'm so sorry," Penny said, "but not enough to stop or not to have a second lover." "God, Penny, 2 lovers. Am I so bad in bed that you had to have 2? Dan groaned. Penny saw the pain in Dan's eyes and knew perfectly well that she was the cause of it. "You're a great lover, Dan," she replied. "You have nothing to do with it, but it's all about me. In my weakness. I found Larry attractive, and that led to me sleeping with him. And to be honest, love was very good. But it was simple. Entertainment. Pleasure. He had nothing to do with love. And in my mind, I was able to separate it from what you and I have. After the first few times, I stopped feeling guilty because I never took anything away from you. When you wanted, I was always there for you." "Does this mean that sometimes you gave me careless seconds?" Dan said, suddenly feeling sick. Penny hesitated and looked away. No answer was needed. Dan jumped up from his chair, ran to the bathroom, and threw up violently. Penny followed him and stood in the doorway. "Does this mean that sometimes I ate the liquid that flowed out of you?" "What is it?" he asked between bouts of vomiting. "Maybe a little," Penny rasped. "But I always cleaned myself up as well as I could before you came home, and I never forced anything on you. It was always when you insisted. I'm telling you, I've never turned you down." Dan bent over the toilet again. After making sure he was done, Penny handed him a wet washcloth. As he cleaned himself up, Dan wondered how his life could have deviated so far by taking the current course. He met Penny at a party at the University of Michigan when they were both students. She was a short girl with small, firm breasts, long blonde hair, and bright green eyes. He was a tall, thin mathematician with curly brown hair and a slight smile. Before the meeting, both had little experience. One date eventually turned into a marriage. The couple was compatible in every way. Especially before the birth of children, it seemed that there was nothing inaccessible to them in the love plan. Penny had a great appetite for love, and Dan made it his mission in life to try to give her as much as she wanted. As the marriage progressed and the children grew, love slowed down and became more moderate. However, to keep the fun going, a couple of times a month arranged special date nights. Dan has been thinking hard about his marriage over the past couple of years. Did he miss Penny when she said she needed more love? Could she really love him and still have not one but two affairs? How could she consider this acceptable, unrelated to their marriage? There's a lot to think about, but it doesn't change anything. 18 years of marriage has become another statistic. Dan's children fully understood their father's desire to move to another city. In the last weeks before the end of the school year, their classmates were quite cruel in their comments. Social media was also unfriendly and gave their mother an unflattering but perhaps accurate nickname, Killer MILF. Although his children protested, Dan forced them to undergo several sessions with a psychologist recommended by his lawyer. For various reasons, both liked 30-year-old Dr. Charlotte Puhaka. "She's pretty cool for a psychologist," his daughter commented. "Yes, and she doesn't look so bad, Dad," said his already grown son, raising his eyebrows. "I'm paying good money for you to talk to her instead of drooling," Dan told his son. Dan only dropped off his children for the first session, so he met Dr. Puhaka only during the second session. He had to admit that his son was good at beauty. Dr. Puhaka appeared to be of Scandinavian descent with long blonde hair, deep blue eyes, alabaster skin, and long legs. The appearance of a pretty doctor would have pleased Thor himself, Dan thought. Dan and the psychologist had their own meeting within a few minutes after the session with the children. He agreed with her assessment that he could use a few sessions too. He knew he had serious trust issues, and he wasn't sure if he would ever be able to overcome them. Dan attended 12 sessions, the same number as his children. He hoped that the resilience of youth would allow his children to overcome any problems they might have much faster than he would overcome his own, and expressed this thought to a psychologist who told him that he could continue to visit her as needed. "But if I'm your patient, we won't be able to date," he said with a grin. "Although that's true, you're making a pretty serious assumption," the doctor said, and her manner wasn't unfriendly. Dan was in no hurry to make acquaintances, either with Dr. Puhaka or with anyone else, despite the fact that several women he knew made it clear to him about their interest. Even with Dan's alimony, half of the couple's estate, her half of the proceeds from the sale of the house and child support, Penny needed to find at least a part-time job after the birth of her second son in order to be able to support herself. She also moved, but tried to stay away from the city where her whole family now lives. She also took back her maiden name and began using her full official name, calling herself Penelope Rhodes. She was proud that she managed to lose weight during pregnancy, and soon she returned to her pre-pregnancy weight. Nevertheless, she did not make acquaintances, although she had many chances. Some of them came from men who recognized her as a killer MILF, despite the fact that she dyed her hair a brunette, and told her that they would not mind lying with her in the hay. The first time she burst into tears, and the second time she ran away from the man. At least no one at her new job recognized the killer MILF in her. And if he did, he was polite enough to keep it to himself. A 43-year-old single woman with a newborn baby and a part-time job had little time for social life. She tried to keep in touch with Ellie and Robbie and gradually restored relations with her parents, who decided that they would not punish the third grandson for his mother's sins. Dr. Charlotte Puhaka was surprised to see that Dan Mattern was calling her. She hadn't spoken to him for more than 6 months, since the day his sessions with her as a patient ended. He expressed interest in meeting her in person, but did nothing, and she assumed that he had found another partner. "Hi, Dan. I thought maybe you forgot my number," she said carelessly, giving him the opportunity to open the door. "No. Just gave us both some time to forget about the doctor-patient relationship, and also to show you that this is not some kind of revenge," Dan said. Charlotte smiled to herself. It's not uncommon for patients of both sexes to become attached to their therapists, especially men, but Dan seems to be different. Charlotte was very pleased because after listening to him during therapy, she decided that Dan was a person she would like to get to know better. It didn't hurt that she found him handsome and lovingly attractive. Dan was pleasantly surprised when he picked up Charlotte the following Friday, asking her out on a date. When I saw her before, she was always dressed professionally, but she dressed much more casually for a date, and much more lovingly. A denim skirt to mid-thigh, a tight white top showing 5 centimeters of a toned stomach, and sandals with 7.5 centimeter heels. He failed to feign indifference as he frankly looked the woman up and down when she met him at the door. "I understand that I'm dressed normally," she said carelessly, walking past him to his car. Yes," Dan replied, catching up with her to open and hold the car door. "Ooh, old school. Manners, I like it," she purred. "Then you can thank my mom when you meet her one day," he said. Charlotte smiled to herself. She's had enough dates to appreciate the little gestures that most men don't do anymore, like opening doors. The restaurant was a first-class barbecue place, which, among other things, offered products from the local distillery. When the waitress offered her a large bib, Charlotte felt a little silly, but decided to accept it after looking around and noticing that many customers were wearing these accessories drenched in barbecue sauce. Dan accepted it gratefully. After learning that Charlotte drinks alcoholic beverages, Dan ordered them both a whiskey tasting set, as well as a glass of iced water. After warning his companion to drink whiskey in small sips, Dan explained which variety is contained in each glass, and some tasting characteristics of each drink. The girl admitted that she was impressed by his knowledge of alcoholic beverages, as well as how well each of the samples combined with barbecue. "So you're a drinker," she said cheerfully, so he'd know she was joking. "You're like an alcoholic sommelier." "Guilty," he replied. "Penny, I liked wine more. I preferred distilled spirits." He hesitated and grimaced when mentioning his ex-wife, especially in front of his former therapist. "Don't do this. Don't think about her," Charlotte said calmly. "She's been an important part of your life for 20 years, and naturally she is in your memories. Don't try to hold them back or feel guilty when they pop up. They will disappear over time, and you'll have new memories with new people." "Damn, I didn't think we'd have a consultation today," he joked. "Nothing like that," she replied, playfully slapping his hand. When the meal was finished, Charlotte noticed that there were a few drops of barbecue sauce left on her bib. "It really saved my blouse," she said, taking off her bib. "It would be awkward to walk around all evening with barbecue sauce on it. And I'd volunteer to lick your blouse for you. Do you remember when Mom taught me manners?" Dan chuckled. Mr. Noble," Charlotte said, and Dan raised his eyebrows. Dan told Charlotte that after dinner they would go to a club with music. After the barbecue restaurant, she assumed that the club would be in the country western style, so she was surprised when they drove up to a club famous for jazz. "Jazz? I'd bet on country music. I thought we were going to dance all night long," she said. Dan giggled again and shook his head. "No country, no hip-hop, no gospel. Screaming guitars are always good. Blues is good. Jazz is good. I'm a man with distinct tastes," he said. "Do I fit into your distinct tastes?" Charlotte asked, making quotation marks in the air as she spoke. "Absolutely," he replied. At the end of the evening, Dan received a chaste kiss. He was surprised when he returned home, and both children were waiting for him in the kitchen of the apartment. "Is it a good date, Dad?" Ellie asked with a wide grin. "Did you keep your hands to yourself and act like a gentleman?" Bobby asked with the same grin. "Give me a break, guys. This is my first date for more than 20 years. God, I don't have any practice at all," Dan said. Both children grinned at each other, then at their father. "I'm not going to help you, Dad. You're on your own here," Ellie giggled. "But we approve of your lady. We both think Dr. Puhaka is wonderful." "Don't screw it up, Dad," Bobby said seriously. Dan and Charlotte were finishing their 4th date in 2 months, sipping coffee with Bailey's Irish cream liqueur in Charlotte's living room, when Charlotte got a serious expression on her face. "Dan, would you like to meet 1 or 2 more women? At least for the sake of comparison. I think you're too fixated on me and you might miss someone you really might like," Charlotte said. "What if I find someone I really like?" he replied. "And I'm definitely fixated on you." Charlotte blushed and smiled. She took the coffee from Dan's hand, pulled him to her, and kissed him passionately. He returned her kiss with the same passion. She led him upstairs to her bedroom. When they got to the bedroom, Charlotte kissed Dan hard, pushing him back against the bed and finally pushing him onto her. When she started to take off his clothes, he reached out and ran his hands over her blouse, causing a long moan, He took off her clothes as quickly as she took off his. Then he pulled her body towards him, causing them both to fall onto the bed. Dan hesitated for a moment, realizing that he hadn't made love to a woman in over a year. But he quickly forgot about it when Charlotte dug her tongue into his mouth in a searing kiss. He reciprocated and slid down her body to her breasts. He slowly inserted 2, then 3 fingers. Charlotte's brain was overloaded. Her vision was blinking. There were explosions in her ears. When she returned to Earth, she realized that someone was... "No, it's her!" He screams. She stopped as soon as she remembered how to do it. Hearing a woman scream, Dan began to use his tongue, lips, and fingers. God, he missed it more than he could have imagined. He didn't know when the scream stopped, but he suddenly became aware of the silence in the room when the woman's body stopped writhing. He could hear her breathing, but when he looked up, her eyes were closed. He didn't know if she was passed out or just relaxed. "Sure. Are you okay, baby?" he whispered. When he got no answer, he asked again. I waited a few seconds before I heard her move. What was that?" "What is it?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Are you okay?" "Absolutely, it was amazing. Can we do it again?" "Oh, yes." He was inspired. The writhing and screaming resumed and continued for another 10 minutes, although she no longer lost consciousness. Stop, stop, stop. It's too sensitive," she croaked. "Take me now, please." "Since you asked politely," he chuckled. Dan climbed onto the bed, kissed the woman hard, pressed himself against her hole, and slowly, lovingly entered inside. She was wet and incredibly hot. For a moment, he tried to remember when Penny had been this hot for him. He hesitated for a moment, realizing what he was thinking, cleared his mind and focused on Charlotte again. He swore to himself that he would not make that mistake again. Charlotte wrapped her legs around Dan's hips as the couple found a rhythm and enjoyed each other's bodies. He felt the woman climax twice more before he felt his own inevitable completion rising in his groin. Dan moved them to the side, but they remained entwined for a long time after Dan brought the matter to an end. For several minutes they kissed, giggled, and talked quietly. "Do you remember when I asked if you wanted to date other women?" "Forget about it. You're mine. You're mine," Charlotte said. During the next outing, a day of golf and go-kart racing before dinner at a Mexican restaurant, the couple were joined by Dan's children. Ellie, Bobby, and Charlotte immediately found a common language. Dan smiled a lot while listening to their conversation. The 10-year age difference between Dan and Charlotte was not even talked about. The couple made wedding plans for a year ahead, until the conversation turned to children. Dan said he thought he was too old for other children, but Charlotte wanted to have at least 2. They compromised for 2 children. Happy wife, happy life, Dan thought to himself. Dan and Charlotte were sitting in their pediatrician's waiting room with their 1-year-old daughter, waiting for the child's first annual checkup, when a familiar face came out of the office, followed by a little boy. "Oh, Dan. Hi," Penny said, surprised. She looked at Charlotte and the baby. "Hi, Penny. Long time no see. Is this your baby?" The last time Dan and Penny were together in the same room was 4 years ago, during the signing of the divorce decision. He noticed that she still looked good, despite a few new wrinkles on her face and about 9 extra pounds. Penny noticed that there was gray in Dan's hair, but he still looked about the same as before, and he didn't seem to have aged a day. Perhaps this is due to the smile on his face, which seemed natural, not forced. She wondered if the pretty blonde holding the baby was the reason for that smile and his youth in general. "This is my son, Will. He's 5 years old now," Penny said. "And this is Genevieve, our daughter," Dan said. "Cher, this is my ex-wife, Penny." The 2 women looked at each other. Penny was still trying to come to terms with the fact that Dan had another child when she came to the conclusion that Charlotte was probably 10 years younger than her and Dan. Charlotte stood up and held out her hand. Penny hesitated before taking the proffered hand. "It's very nice to finally meet you. The kids speak very highly of you," Penny said. Charlotte just nodded. Dan knew that his wife was an amiable woman, but she wouldn't lie by saying the same thing to his ex-wife, because it wasn't true. At least in her presence, the only thing Ellie and Bobby ever talked about Penny was her health. Dan told his children that although he didn't mind them continuing to love their mother, he didn't want to ever talk about her again. Both children understood and respected his request. "She looks just like Bobby when he was a baby," Penny said, looking at the baby. "Bobby seems to be a very caring older brother. He's turned into a young man," Dan said. And Ellie is quite a young woman. They seem like that, judging by the little I see these days, she said. She noticed Dan's gaze and quickly added, I don't blame them for not visiting us more often. I understand that they are busy, but I would still like to see them more often. I am their mother. Charlotte looked down, hoping the other woman wouldn't notice. She wasn't going to tell Penny that Ellie and Bobby had been calling her mom for the past 2 years. Dan felt that he needed to say something to relieve the awkwardness. Anything. I hope this is just an inspection. I hope you have Your son is fine, he said. Penny caught the hesitation when it came to her son's name. Of course, Ellie and Bobby had to say something about Will from time to time, and of course Dan just forgot, she hoped to herself. Dan noticed the mistiness in her eyes and felt guilty. Honesty is the best policy. You're their mother, and I'm glad that you're present in their lives at the level they want. But at home we don't talk about you. Almost never. You broke my heart, and I felt like I needed a break from you. Children understand this perfectly well. I don't know anything about your life since we broke up. Wow, Penny said in a half-whisper. We had 18 good years together, and you can just cut me out of your life as if our marriage never happened, like amputation. It's cruel. You did what you did. Now I'm doing what I need to do to live my life. I'm moving on. I'm living in the present, not the past, Dan said. So like I said, I hope you're going to be okay. Penny took a step back as if Dan had hit her in response. It's one thing to be hated, and quite another to be simply ignored. Yeah, sort of, mostly, she finally replied. I work part-time at the library. Will goes to kindergarten. I go on dates occasionally. Not many men want to seriously date a 40-year-old woman with a small child. I understand. It's my fault. I didn't want it to be like this, Dan said, visibly wincing. Well, I guess it's just my cue to leave, Penny said. It was nice to meet you, Charlotte. Take care of him. He's a good man. One day I forgot about it, and look what it's led to. Penny took her son's hand and left the waiting room. Dan smiled shyly at his wife. I understand. You don't have to say anything. Her antics had brought her to this point. That's not my problem. I won't lose a minute of sleep over her, Dan said. You know I'm not your therapist 24 hours a day, Charlotte replied. Sometimes I'm just your wife, the mother of your child. Now kiss me and stop analyzing me. Just love it. I can do that, he said affirmatively.